Good evening, everyone. A lot of people are talking about the government's policy on immigration and citizenship, basically focusing on the crisis in the Middle East, where Canada has taken its part as part of the UN mandate to help resettle people that have been displaced by conflict in the Middle East. This presentation is going to discuss the cost that's going to be incurred by Canada as well as provinces down to the municipal level as part of resettlement of the Syrian crisis, as we refer to as refugees in Canada. Now, this is one perspective of refugees. You're more welcome to go out to what CTV says, CBC, even the various banks or other perspectives in terms of the overall cost, in terms of the government's taxation dollars, in terms of reflecting this particular program as part of resettlement. A little bit brief bio about myself. I'm a CPA CGA by trade. I've got extensive experience in business, so I typically come at it by analyzing the policy, looking at solutions, but also understanding some of the risks that will be impacted by government. In this particular case, I'll be focusing some of the risk and the cost overruns that could impact taxation dollars. I'll talk about the annual budget for the government of Canada in terms of what they plan to do in terms of spending. I'll do a little bit of an immigration analysis. I'll talk about requests for plans and priorities, which is basically part of the budget cycle and basically governs the budgets in terms of the mandates. And I'll talk a bit about facts and figures around the refugees. Now, if we look at a nutshell, when the budget was set up, the idea of the resettlement was supposed to be included as part of the direct program spending. So when you're looking at the trend for 2016, you're looking at about $9 billion more in spending and direct program spending. Well, the immigration policies are part of direct program spending, and that's what you're seeing on the right-hand side of the column. I laid out key programs from First Nations, immigration, defense, and climate change as part of the overall mandate of the Liberal government in terms of extending funding out. Then I particularly focused on key areas like the $6.5 billion plan to help countries go to green technology and climate change over a period of time. So that might be over 4 or 5 years where they'll allocate money each year over that. But it's a commitment. That's taxpayers' dollars that's going outside Canada. Another $1.6 billion going into stabilization areas outside of Canada, again over a 3-year period. So it's looking like about $550 million that's going to there. And then we're getting into the resettlement costs. What they're basically saying, we're only going to spend about $110 million to resettle Syrian refugees at a federal level. That's what that cost is. And I'll go into more specific details where that number might be understated when we look at the specific programs that are attached to as part of resettlement. Now, like anything else, I like to look at reports and priorities. It sets the goals and sets the agendas in terms of things. So what they plan to spend in 2016-2017 in terms of the immigration area, and that's what you're seeing, the $1.4 billion spending. But what you should bear in mind is the headcount target. Now, basically, unless it changes, they're going to have less headcount to process immigration claims. So in other words, they may steer people that have been in that process to unite families from India, China, whoever, to focus more on the refugees. So in other words, some of these unification areas and other programs may be delayed as they focus those resources on the refugee status within Syria. The second point that I want to bring up as well is if you look at the numbers significantly change or reduced in the following year, yet we know point blank that at least it's going to cost $150 to $200 million to resettle these people. So other programs have been shelved with the money being diverted to the Syrian resettlement. Now, there's a lot of debate that goes around in terms of resettlement. The government's saying it's going to cost $8,000 per refugee. That's probably an understated number, and the reason why I tell you, when you attach all the aspects of what it takes to resettle from training and housing, social system, education, and healthcare, that number likely is doubled, and some of that burden will be pushed down to the municipality level and down to the provincial level as part of the overall cost sharing. But nothing has been said by the federal government in terms of how they're going to allocate support to those programs to help resettle people. So this is something to bear in mind. The second point I wanted to make out is, and it's something that's not discussed either, that's in the media as well. We had a huge fire in Fort McMurray that's still going on. We evacuated a city of 100,000 people, and basically the federal contribution right now is about $100 million. Now, if we blow things up into a certain perspective and look at the Slave Lake fire, it's 1.3 billion. It's not unheard of when everything is said and done. The Fort McMurray fire might be 5 times that, too close to 6.5 to $7 billion in terms of cost. So it'll be interesting how everything plays out from the provincial side to the federal government in terms of getting Fort McMurray back on the ground. Now, Fort McMurray is a very critical aspect of the economy because the oil sands is there. The oil drives 1/3 of the exports. So while the government of Canada is focused on refugee resettlements, you would think they'd be concerned a little bit more about Fort McMurray because it drives economic growth. Economic growth drives that taxpayers' dollars. So it's very interesting when we look at the facts and figures to kind of get things in perspective of what's going on with the program. We're not getting clear indications of the refugee status in terms of the cost, and it's something that you need to be asking your local politician. Now, there's a lot of facts and figures thrown around, and I'll be clear and succinct in a couple ways. One is the program itself, when they budgeted, was about $700 million. Now, that's what they said allocated in the first year to resettle people in terms of the cost. When we see the actual payout, it might be a lot higher in terms of the actual results, because in March, we've seen that the government went from a $7 billion surplus to a $2 billion deficit in 1 month. That tells me they were starting to settle up some expenses, and it'll be interesting how this plays out in terms of the refugee status when they do a full accounting in terms of the Immigration and Citizenship area. It's something to watch out. The second point I want to make out is that they're under budgeting. They're basically saying it's only going to cost X amount of dollars to basically resettlement. And I showed you in that previous slide, like $8K. That's a low number. When you start looking at rent costs, you're looking at everything else. The average rent in Canada is about $1,100. Okay, well, refugees coming here need a place to stay, so they're going to at least need $1,100 to cover the rent. So you can look at the cost of living at a bare minimum is about $31,000 per year on cost. So where is that money coming from in terms of things? Well, it's going to come from municipalities, from social welfare. It's going to come from provincial governments in terms of the health care. It's also going to come from the federal government. So you're going to see that that number actually might be closer than $24,000. The second point I want to make clear, and it's not clear in the stats when you go to the government site, is we don't know the dynamics or the makeup of this population in terms of who's coming here. There's no clear stats to see if it's Christians, whether it's the Kurds in the north. So it's something else that needs to be asked of the government of Canada in terms of its perspective and its policies. So what I encourage people when you're asking questions is to ask very specific questions around what's going on with the government. The next slide I want to show you is food usage, food bank usage, which is a critical area. In 2015, we had close to 900,000 families or people living off food banks. The Syrians now are actually coming in and living off the food banks, so they're putting more pressure on local donations and government to help support food banks. And that's critical to understand that we had enough pressure on that, but we're adding another 25,000, 27,000 people to that food bank stats, puts more pressure on Canadians who may not be getting the service that's required. So this presentation was to give you a brief introduction of what's going on with the refugee status, but it's really designed to kind of have you ask questions of your local MP to basically say what's a clear costing of this program to bring people in. Also, when they start talking about economic benefits, we're in a sluggish economy, which means we're barely making enough men's to bring in our youth employment in. We're now adding more people here to add to the employment role, so you're adding more pressure on job creators. That's not discussed. You know, maybe over the long haul they'll bring some benefit, but the number's too small to say that what they will bring unless we know that skill set. And that's something that's not asked by the general population in terms of things. You really need a true accounting from the cost side and the skills being brought in. And that's not something that's been clear either in the media or from the government of Canada in terms of what are we bringing to this country. The reason why I did this presentation is to give you a clear indication. There's a lot of open-ended questions here that need to be more transparent. The reason why I'm asking these questions is because the government of Canada went on a platform to get elected on is transparency and full accountability. If that's the case, then why are their stats on their sites not telling you enough of the picture? And that's something that needs to be asked, because right now when you go to the website, you're not getting enough information on the true cost of this. And that's why I wanted to pose these questions out there. These are things you should be asking of your local politicians or the Prime Minister himself in terms of how is this program going to keep the cost control and what's the benefit going to be. Thank you.